Good morning, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to our discussion today of U.S.-Russian relations hitting the guardrails. Now, when Jill Dougherty and I first talked about having this seminar about a month ago, little did we know that today, April 15th, the United States government would have imposed, I think, the largest number of sanctions that have been imposed on one day in a very long time. Certainly since 2014, I would say. And we have sanctions now on Russia's non-ruble and ruble-denominated sovereign debt. U.S. financial institutions cannot trade in them. We have sanctions with the expulsion of 10 diplomatic personnel. We have sanctions against the SVR and other personnel. And these sanctions are in response both to the SolarWinds hack last year, to the election interference in 2020 that was reported a few months ago, to what's happening on the Russian-Ukrainian border, to the persecution of opponents of President Putin, to the paying of bounties for US soldiers in Afghanistan. So the list is very long. These are really very all-encompassing sanctions. And yet we also know that 2 days ago, President Biden and President Putin had a phone call, the second since President Biden came into the White House, and that after complaining about various things, President Biden also offered to hold a summit in a third country, and said that the U.S. wants a quote unquote stable and predictable relationship with Russia. So what are we to make of all of this? And we couldn't have a better panel to do this. I'm going to introduce the moderator, and that is, of course, our own Jill Dougherty. She is an adjunct professor at Georgetown at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. And she's also a global fellow at the Wilson Center. And she was a longtime CNN correspondent, both in Moscow, in the State Department, and in other places. So let me turn it over to you, Jill.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Stent. Really, you are right. When we were talking about this, we had no idea about the timing today. And I know it's an extremely busy news day, and I'm extremely grateful for both of our guests, and I'll introduce them in a moment, to join us because the pressures are large. We have one journalist in Moscow and one in Kiev, Ukraine. So let's begin with introductions. In Ukraine, in Kiev, is Anton Troianovski. He's the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times. And in Moscow, Elena Chernenko, she is special correspondent for a Kommersant newspaper, which, as I'm sure our guests, as our audience knows, is one of the leading newspapers in Russia. Obviously, it has a website. And she is fresh from her very interesting interview with Nikolai Patrushev, who's the head of President Putin's National Security Council. So I'm sure both of them are going to have to run back to work very quickly, but we do have an hour. And I want to welcome both of them. We have an hour. We will talk, and I'll ask a few questions. We'll have a discussion for, let's say, about a half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. And then we will open it up to questions. And just to remind our audience, if you can put your questions in the Q&A function and just identify yourself, it would be really good. You know, welcome again, Elena and Anton. I just wanted to say, you know, a few minutes ago, maybe about a half an hour ago, I was watching Russian TV, which I have here on my cable. And I was watching the spokesperson for the foreign ministry saying, well, at this very minute, we have the American ambassador in our building, and he's here. We have called him in, and it's going to be a discussion, and it won't be very pleasant for him. So it was a warning. I mean, this is a very dramatic moment, and Dr. Stent outlined these really major, significant sanctions that are being introduced. So let's start with that. The sanctions, I won't go through them because Dr. Stent did. But I would like to let's go to Elena, I think first, since you're in Moscow. How serious is this for Russia? And how could it respond?
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. And yes, it's an absolutely crazy day. I would not have expected. I expected us to be talking for maybe like more than an hour on a more quieter day, but today is really a day for the U.S.-Russian relations. News are popping in every second on my phone. Well, you asked about the impact here. I think it is serious. Dr. Stant is absolutely right that this is quite a package of sanctions. We have seen the ruble shaking already on just the news of the sanctions being introduced. And now I'm not an economist, but I'm reading very much on how these experts here evaluate the negative effects for the Russian economy of these sectoral economic sanctions that have been introduced. But of course, overall, for the relations, that's going to be the main object suffering. This is a very big blow for the U.S.-Russian relations. I mean, there are tense already. They are, as Nikolai Patrushev said, and I would probably agree with him, they are the lowest point since the beginning of the 90s. And now with very, very subtle hopes for something like a deconfrontation because of a possible meeting between the two presidents, now that's a total blow for them. I'm not even sure that such a meeting will take place, and we will see how Russia will respond. Yes, they asked the US ambassador to come to the MFA, and what we are hearing, I don't know if this will prove correct in the end, but that Russia might react asymmetrically, like non-proportional, at least on the diplomatic side, that, for example, more diplomats might be expelled than the US is expelling from Washington. So I think there will be a strong reaction.
Anton, could we turn to you? I know you're in Kiev and you're covering that story, which we will be discussing, but you are the bureau chief. So obviously you have a view on what's going on. How do you look at this? I mean, how serious, let me ask the same questions. How serious is it? And what could Russia do at this moment to respond?
Well, as to the seriousness, I completely agree with what Elena just said about the real difficult state that the relationship is in. The one thing I'm wondering about, and frankly, if Elena, I'd love to hear your view on this, is the Biden administration has clearly been, first of all, they've been telegraphing these sanctions and actually stating pretty openly that these sanctions are coming for a long time, certainly well before the phone call with Putin that Biden had the other day. And second, you hear it from the Biden administration pretty much every time that they talk about imposing costs on Russia. They also say, we want a stable, productive relationship with Russia. That was in the first sentence of the White House statement on the sanctions today. The United States desires a relationship with Russia that is stable and predictable. So what I'm wondering about is, to what extent is the Biden administration successful here in somehow creating these multiple tracks in the relationship? To what extent is that something that Moscow is open to? You know, I think these next few days and weeks are going to be really key in understanding that, and what happens here in Ukraine, I think, will be part of the answer as well.
Yeah, Elena, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, Anton, you're a great journalist. You just hit absolutely the point and the question that we have been asking today. All of our Russian speakers, officials from the MFA, people in the Duma, and that's exactly what's the key point right now. This strategy of kind of walking and chewing gum, as you say it in English, right? It worked out after 2014 when the first rounds of sanctions were introduced, but then we have seen in 2015 Russia cooperating very intensively and very positively with the US on the Iran deal. But I'm not sure this strategy will work out again. More and more voices here, even from very liberal-minded people here in Russia, are telling now this is not going to work out. This compartmentalization, correct me if I'm not saying it right, but that walking and chewing gum at the same time, that's probably not going to work out that well this time. There's voices saying that not even a meeting at the heads of state level is needed anymore, and Russia should maybe stop cooperating on those issues that are of mutual interest. And I must say, for myself personally, I just texted a friend that I'm starting to get more hawkish because I just don't understand how this is a strategy, how this should change behavior, what the goal of these sanctions is. We have seen statements from the administrations where they openly said that they want the Russian economy to suffer. Now that means they want common Russians to suffer, me personally as well. How is that a good strategy for good relations and changing behavior? I'm not sure.
Yeah, usually the administration wouldn't say that they want individual citizens, regular Russians to suffer, but they usually try to say the economy can be affected. Obviously, Dr. Stent might have some thoughts on this, but I was looking very quickly, I was looking at Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor for President Biden, saying this morning, respond, but don't escalate. So it would appear that we've got now, and it's a new administration, just a couple of months in office, it appears that they're putting together their policy, which is, walk and chew gum at the same time. Respond, don't escalate, make pressure, put pressure on Russia, but at the same time, find ways to work together. And Dr. Stent, if you want to jump in at any time, I think the question would be, is this going to work? Is this a workable strategy?
Well, I'll just say, I think, this is a great discussion. Before it has been US policy, again, if you go back to the Obama administration or even before that, you have a compartmentalized relationship, you work on some things together, but you compete and have, uncooperative relations on the other. The question is there some point at which, that becomes more difficult to do? And I think the issue with sanctions is they're punitive. Just to really echo what Elena was saying, they're punitive. They will affect the Russian economy. They'll affect Russian people. They're going to affect, by the way, the properties of some of the oligarchs that are close to President Putin. But will they have any impact in altering Russia's calculation about things that it does? Because the sanctions don't carry any incentives. They have nothing in them to say, if you cease doing some of these things, then we'll remove the sanctions. So that's always the problem with the sanctions, is the punitive aspect may work, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a change in actions that the US would like.
Mm-hmm. Anton, what do you think about that? Will this work?
Oops, sorry. I think at this point, it almost feels like we've had so many sanctions and so much talk of sanctions that I assume there must be a calculation at the senior levels of the Russian government that if a certain step is taken, then sanctions are to be expected, and there's then a decision made in part that weighs or appraises those costs. So as Dr. Stent said, in a world where those sanctions don't have a clear exit spelled out for them, that becomes much harder to work with from a diplomatic point of view in terms of exiting this situation. But yeah, I honestly just don't know where this goes from here.
Elena, let me just jump back to you. Definitely, but could I just ask you, as I ask that question, will it work? I think I would have to define, what does it mean to work? According to the United States, it's to change Russia's malign behavior. But I would just pop that in as a second question, but please go ahead.
I just wanted to add on what Anton and Dr. Stent said, from the point of view of this concept of carrots and sticks. And there's only sticks, because even one time where clearly a carrot was needed, it was not given. I'm talking about the sanctions on the Kerch Strait incident, which were introduced about 2 years ago. Russia did everything to kind of minimize the damage from that incident. It gave back the ships, it released the soldiers. Nothing happened. Not a single person was taking off that very special Kerch Strait dedicated list. Now, I asked one Western diplomat in a off-the-record conversation, it was cat-and-mouse conversation, so I can quote him, but not his name. Why has Russia not been kind of benefiting from its good behavior? Where is the carrot? So what he said was, well, Russia cannot undo the incident. And the sanctions were introduced for that incident. Well, that's crazy. I mean, yes, you cannot undo this, but then the sanction strategy is not going to change any behavior. If you're good behavior, it doesn't get you anywhere.
You know, this is, there are other subjects that we want to get into, but I think we just have to continue to go with this a little bit. I actually am seeing some questions in the chat, and I want to get to them a little separately, but here's one that the opinion, Anders Asland is saying the summit with Biden is vital to Putin. So let me get into that. That was, I guess, kind of the carrot that President Biden presented, which is, you know, we've got these difficulties, but we can sit down and we want the relationship to work out, or at least to be able to cooperate in some manner to discuss the issues. Do you think, does either Elena or Anton think that, and Elena, you hinted at this, but do you think that there is going to be a summit in a third party, in a third country? Anton?
Well, I obviously don't know whether there'll be a summit, but I do think this is a, you know, there's a lot of talk in right now that a potential summit would be a gift to Putin, and that was something that was discussed a lot back in the Trump days in the context of the Helsinki summit. I think the situation is a little bit different now, where we hear so much in the Russian media and from Russian officials about the what they describe as the near impossibility of working with the U.S., that nothing can be accomplished. And so at this point, I think we're in a situation where for Putin, publicly saying no to a Biden summit would also carry a lot of political value, which in the calculation of some might even exceed the value of having a summit, certainly in the wake of these latest sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Elena?
I would not bet on any of the outcome or for a summit happening or being canceled, but I see the possibilities and the reasonings for both of the options. I mean, what can Russia gain from a summit except for just the fact of it happening? There is not a possibility of any agreements in any spheres that can be reached fast in the coming weeks or months. Nothing will change on the sanctions sphere. We have seen with Jackson Vanik, which was quite a precise and a much smaller law, how long it took for it to be replaced with yet another Russia punishing law. And now there is like a whole bunch, it's almost the Iranian scenario that is now implied on Russia. So I'm not sure if there is any reason for Russia now to meet, except for that Russians like summits.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Stent, before we go on to other subjects, can you do you have anything to add to this?
No, I think we already have some interesting things also in the chat function. Let's go on to some others.
We do. The chat is there. I'm almost tempted to get into the chat. But I would say, okay, so there are two that we have that are from people who definitely are Russia experts. Ambassador William Courtney saying that by walking and chewing gum, apropos, in 1987, at the same time that Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, the US was arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, including with Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. So I guess the point is, yes, this has been tried before, and yes, it can work. if either of you wanted to say anything final on that. And then, as I pointed out, Anders Aslan's comments, that he thinks that these are, it's a long comment, you can see it in chat, but he does think that it's been done correctly, talking with allies, coordinating within the whole of government, etc. We'll just have to see. I'm struck by the fact that, you know, you did have this idea that it would not be obviously ever a reset, but that somehow, at least the American administration, the Biden administration, could talk with Russia. And now it would appear that even that talking is going to be very freighted by all of this emotion and anger over this really draconian sanctions regime. So anyone else want to join in? Oh, I do see, sorry, one more in chat, because I'll move on to the chat. How much of this is political? This is from Dan Lieberman. How much of this is political to satisfy domestic wants and show Democratic Party toughness and gain public support for party initiatives? That's really kind of a domestic question, but let's put it in this way. How much, Elena, do you think that domestic politics are playing into this for both leaders?
I certainly have the feeling that this is important for the reasoning, the logic of the U.S. administration. I might not be the best to comment on this. Maybe Dr. Stant or Anton will take that one. But of course, the Russian reaction will be very much also a message to the domestic audience, and we will see something very quick. We'll see reactions towards, for example, expelling U.S. diplomats, but also to this climate summit that the U.S. is organizing, and where Putin is one of the invitees.
Okay, Anton?
Yeah, I would just throw in to the question of whether walking and chewing gum at the same time is feasible here. There's certainly many reasons to think, as Elena has said, this is not going to work. I think the one thing worth mentioning as to why there still might be a chance for that approach to work is the fact that I think the public opinion polling and just my own travels and conversations around Russia with Russians show that a great deal of people don't want the things to get even worse. A great deal of people don't want Russia to be engaged in hostile ways around the world. Certainly, the state media can change that narrative and say this is about protecting Russia from hostility from abroad. That's something that's going on very fervently right now, and something that works. But still, I think this is not 2014. This is not 2015. The domestic political situation has changed. And again, I think there's a great deal of polling showing that the Russian attitudes toward the West have improved over the last few years. And one question is, of course, these new sanctions. How much do they change that?
Okay.
I react right away, very shortly on this. I can't only talk about my own feelings because I haven't seen any polls on that, but I feel angry. Like being a common Russian citizen, that I really think this goes too far. This is not helpful. This is not how you minimize damage, how you try to deconflict and to prevent confrontation. And yes, I do have a very positive attitude towards the West. I'm personally very liberal minded, but no, I would not be happy with if the Russian government would do as nothing happened and continue cooperating with like ignoring that these draconian sanctions, as Jill put it, are in place, and that our country is put into the space where Iran is into the corner.
I see another question in chat. So I've moved over to the chat because it's been very much on the subject. Michael Skaggs saying, these sanctions are a response to solar winds. I don't understand why that hasn't been part of the discussion. Actually, it was brought up by Dr. Stent right at the beginning. not only solar winds, but interference in the elections, corruption. There were a number of reasons, and you can go online now and see the statement from the White House and from Treasury, et cetera, giving really a plethora of reasons for this. In fact, I think, as Dr. Stent noted at the top, that is really significant, that it's not just one or two discrete issues. This is really kind of across the board. So I want to move on because we're at the halfway point and we have a lot of other subjects, but could we move on to Ukraine? Because if we hadn't had this announcement this morning, I think Ukraine probably would have been at the top of the list, and it's extremely important. We have, these reports of up to 40,000 Russian troops and equipment on the border with Ukraine moved up there. Reports of troops in Crimea, a lot of concern, a lot of warning, a lot of signaling from both sides. And yet it's not really clear. The West is has been demanding, Russia, explain yourself, and Russia is not doing that. So there's a real lack of clarity. Anton, you're there. You know the situation. What is the purpose? What is President Putin trying to do with these maneuvers?
Well, frankly, this is something that people here also don't fully understand. There's only informed speculation that you can do here, but there does seem to be overall agreement. First of all, still, even as those troops continue to mass, I think the voices that tell you this is more likely to be something done for show, to make a political point, to practice coercive diplomacy. You hear more of those voices rather than those that say this we are really for sure seeing a preparation for an actual invasion here. But most importantly, we just have to say, as with a lot, I think, in journalism, we just don't know for sure where this is going. But as to why, I think Elena could perhaps speak to the extent of Russian disappointment, the Kremlin's disappointment with President Zelensky, with any hopes they may have had about a change on the ground, any progress in negotiations, as that would be perceived to be in the Russian direction. Of course, President Zelensky cracked down very directly on Medvedchuk, the pro-Putin oligarch who's very influential here in Ukraine, and in particular his television channels. His Russian language television channels that have been very influential. That's the domestic Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Russian context. You have the international context of Biden coming into office, and this potentially being seen as a test of Joe Biden, and by the way, of the fact that these sanctions were clearly coming down the pike. And finally, there is I think the domestic Russian context that can't be ignored as well, which is that in January, second half of January, just as these military tensions on the ground heightened, you had Alexey Navalny returning to Russia. You had protests in February in January, and at the beginning of February across the country. Now, this situation has replaced Navalny at the top of the news agenda in Russia for the time being. So there's a lot of factors here. I'll stop there.
On purpose, you would say it was one of the purposes could be to move the story.
I think we can't, again, I as a Moscow correspondent, I try to stay away from kind of Kremlinology as much as possible. But it can't be ignored that has been an effect of this situation.
Mm-hmm. Elena, now to the kind of Moscow perspective, you've been obviously covering this and have some viewpoints. I guess we'd have to start with, what is the purpose of all of this? There are some theories out there. One is rattle Zelensky and Ukraine, signal to the Biden administration, or maybe even a real invasion. Now, where do you come down on this? What do you think is going on?
I do think it's signaling. It's signaling to Kiev and to Washington. Very much of the things that are grievances for Russia, Anton said, and a change of behavior of Zelensky that came into power as a more balanced, I would say, president that was looking forward to negotiate, that promised to bring peace. But he changed in the recent months, especially in the recent weeks. He became, I would say, ultra patriotic, and he's trying to kind of win back his popularity in these ways. And I think there are concerns here that he might be tempted to actually try a power scenario to get the Donbass back with a very short and powerful military action, which would probably boost his popularity. That's what we are hearing here, but I'm not sure. I'm also not very good at Kremlinology. There is a great piece of Dmitry Trenin that just came yesterday out on the Carnegie website in Russian, but I think it's already in English, where he explains very good the reasoning that he sees behind Moscow's behavior. And Dmitry Trenin is one of the best, if not the best, in understanding these things. The only story that I would disagree maybe with Anton, I don't think this has anything to do with Navalny. I mean, Navalny was out of the news quite fast after he was in jail. We are seeing reporting on him mostly in the private media and the media that are working from outside of Russia, like what's happening with his health and with his supporters. It's not a story for the main audience. They have almost, I would not say forgotten, but it's not getting their attention. And yeah, I don't think this has any connection. I would say it's signaling. It's signaling. It's a warning to both Kiev and to Washington.
Mm-hmm. I want to remind the audience that we're totally open to questions now. And if you want to put them in, if you can put your name and add them to the Q&A function below, that would be great. We have a number of other subjects that I want to get into. And maybe, maybe we should go to Navalny, because that's another situation. Obviously, it just came up, but there are questions. I follow obviously what the Navalny people are saying, and then government statements on this. Navalny people are saying Mr. Navalny is on a hunger strike. He is very sick. He's lost a lot of weight, and he's on the hunger strike because apparently he wants outside doctors to come in and treat what he believes is a problem. It sounds like kind of a nerve problem, but whatever. And the government is saying, no, our doctors say he's going to be okay. We had a interestingly former Russian woman, Maria Butova, who was here in the States serving time in prison, who went back to Russia, joined RT, and went into the prison, into the work area where Navalny is being held. And she said conditions were very good. So there is a lot of, I would say, posturing about this, and it's hard to really break it down and know precisely what is happening. Anton, could we go to you? Do you have any clarity as to Navalny's real situation? Is he in danger? How seriously ill is he? What does President Putin want to do with him? Plans to do with him? Well, let's start with those, if you could. I know you're in Kiev, but you've been following.
Yeah, definitely. I think I think we have no reason to not believe he is indeed on a hunger strike, or at least that that he is having problems with his health. You're right. There's a lot of different reporting there, and I think something the Russian state media does very well on these kinds of issues is to throw out competing narratives that muddle the water overall. His wife and his mother and his lawyer visited Navalny in jail in recent days, and all reported that he's really not doing well, as you would expect someone to be after being on a hunger strike for about 2 weeks. As to what happens next, again, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, skip that one, because I really cannot predict Putin's action.
Yeah. Well, then let me ask you, and then I'll go to Elena. If you take sanctions, because there have been sanctions actually invoked by the United States because of the poisoning, and there could be more coming down the pike, do you think that sanctions in this case really do much with the situation with, freeing Navalny?
You know, that's a great question, and that's something that I've put to Navalny's team in the past. And what they told me even recently, back in January, I believe it was that sanctions for them are not primarily about directly putting pressure on the Russian leadership to change their direction in the near term. They see it as part of this larger strategy. To be clear, I think what the Navalny team sees as the most potent weapon in securing his freedom is street protests, and that's why clearly so much planning is going in to now putting together this next nationwide Russian protest that they're organizing online right now. Sanctions for them is more to make this point internationally, to keep Navalny on the agenda internationally, and to show to Russians that other countries are paying attention. But I don't think there's a view that a particular sanction will directly lead to a particular action on the part of someone in a senior role in Russia.
Mm-hmm. Elena, you said that the Russian public, for the most part, aren't really paying that much attention to this. But what do you think in terms of Navalny and where President Putin wants to go with this? I mean, some people say literally that President Putin wants to kill him, but others would say it's basically sidelining him. He's now, in a kind of remote location, he can't talk very much, although his people continue to communicate. What's the purpose of holding him? And I know you don't like to predict what's going to happen, but do you think this will be an indefinite situation of holding him?
I'm really not a good person to ask that, because I don't cover inner politics. So I'm all about Russia's foreign policy. All I can say is, if I were in the government, I would do my utmost to get all the doctors that are willing to come and see him to go and visit him, because from a PR point of view, that's a catastrophe. And it's continuing, and it seems like they're doing one mistake after another in that case. There are so many better options that could have been chosen, and right now we are seeing yet another failure to make it better than the Russian government could.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to go to some of the questions. Another one from Bill Courtney. Could meeting Biden at a summit meeting help Putin and united Russia in the September Duma elections? And that is an important fact that we have to get into, the Duma elections in September, or not make much difference. Anton, what do you think?
I think that's a great question, and certainly something you see in polls that, and I hear this all the time too from Russians, that what impresses Russians the most about Putin is his stature on the international stage and his foreign policy action and security policy actions. So I think from kind of an electoral strategy perspective, anything that highlights Putin's global stature in the run-up to elections, you would expect to help Putin. But I would also note that, given the extent of the Russian state's ability to control these elections, to control who gets to vote, when people vote. If you look at United Russia winning 99% of the vote in a significant number of Russian regions, the outcome of this election, I think, is also not going to be determined by such classical electoral strategic questions.
Mm-hmm. Elena, you were mentioning, if I understood it correctly, that if President Putin were to say, no, I don't want to meet, and refuse to meet, it actually might work for him politically more positively than sitting down with Biden. Did I understand that correctly? And what do you think?
Absolutely. In the current status of relations, I don't know what deliverables one could expect from such a summit. What would be the concrete agreements that the two sides could reach? What would be the benefits? A meeting that would be kind of a reminding of the first meeting between high representatives of the U.S. administrations and the Chinese in Alaska, where just the two sides exchange arguments publicly and very critical of each other. That does not bring much. But in the current situation, saying that the US is punishing Russia for nothing, the US is trying to isolate and put Russia into a corner, we are not going to go along with that. We're not meeting. We are not saying yes to such a summit. I think that would resonate with quite a lot of Russians.
And yet, I was putting together a little list here of the upcoming meetings between Russian officials and Americans, at least if they go forward. We had Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the United States spoke with the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, by telephone on March 31st. We have, again, if it takes place, Foreign Minister Lavrov meeting Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the Arctic Council, and that's coming up May 19th. And then we have this proposed summit. So, and the conversation between Biden and Putin. So there is more, with this administration, there is more communication, number one, and outreach. And yet we're in a situation right now where it seems very, very more fraught than ever. So I guess, Anton, I'll turn to you. When you evaluate this, we're getting back to the original comments and the questions that we're looking at. Is this kind of dual strategy a good idea, do you think, for the administration, believing that even if it ups the ante in certain areas, that the communication can continue?
Well, I think it depends. One really interesting thing, and I think Mr. Aslan pointed this out in his comment there, was that these sanctions have been so carefully telegraphed and ahead of time. And I know in the past, the U.S. has given the Russians a heads up, the Russian officials a heads up about sanctions that are coming. So, and I think that this sort of more methodical approach to diplomacy probably is a difference from the way that the Trump administration approached sanctions toward Russia. And we shouldn't forget that the Trump administration did, in fact, sanction Russia repeatedly. And in the case of the sanctions involving Rusal, Oleg Deripaska's aluminum giant, those were quite damaging as well back in 2018 to the Russian economy. So you do see a different approach here. And as a quick note, as we're talking, I got an email here from Cornell University, where Nicholas Mulder, assistant professor of history, says these sanctions are relatively mild. So there are different views on the draconianness of these sanctions as well.
Elena, do you think that they're mild? And what do you think ultimately the real effect on Russia will be? How damaging is this?
I think it's up to people that are into economy to actually evaluate the effect on the Russian economy, short term and long term. well, we have seen, as I said, the ruble reacting very quickly to only the announcement of sanctions. And I would argue with Anton, it doesn't matter at all if there is a heads up. I mean, what's the difference? Washington is telling Moscow, we are going to sanction you next week, and then the sanctions come. What's the difference with just sanctioning? I mean, it's the most important is the sanctions themselves, not the warning about them. I don't think it matters that much. So yeah.
But previously, let's look at the Trump administration and the Biden administration. With the Trump administration, you didn't have a lot of heads up. I mean, sanctions were being invoked, et cetera. But there seemed to be a lack of a very, let's call it, cohesive strategy and approach. If the Biden administration is taking a more cohesive approach and actually talking with Russia in advance, is that, with all the bad aspects of what we're talking about right now, is that a better approach? You know, a more direct way of communicating with Russia, Anton?
I mean, I do actually, I understand Elena's point. You know, what I'm seeing here is, for now, we can see there is a difference in style here, clearly, from the Biden administration, but it is indeed far too soon to tell whether that will bear any fruit or actually affect the Russian response on this.
Yes, Elena.
I would say the difference is there, and it's negative. Under the Trump administration, we have seen several rounds of sanctions, but the people, the nature of sanctions was different. There were mostly personal sanctions against personalities. They were put on blacklists. Most of the people were expecting to get on some kind of a Western sanction list anywhere. So all of the people that did something wrong or were thinking that they might have a chance to get on such a list, they already have gotten their money and their property out of these countries. I'm talking about the EU and the US. So it was personal sanctions, and then entities were put on blacklists. Well, now we see like sanctions across everything. It's personal, it's diplomatic, it's economic sectoral sanctions. And then this executive order that goes by them allows for such sanctions in future to be introduced against whatever Russia does anywhere in the world. It's a total new approach to sanctions. It's sweeping. It's really the Iranian style sanctions. It's not entities and concrete persons anymore. It's the whole Russian economy and the whole Russian state. It's different, and it's much worse.
Dr. Sten, I can't give up the opportunity to ask you this, because you've been called by every news organization this morning to comment on this. So perhaps you'll share your view. I mean, Elena is saying this is, Iranian style sanctions. Is this too much? Is this overplaying it?
Well, I think when you read, certainly when you read what both the Treasury Department and the White House has put out, it does sound very sweeping, and it does address all of the issues that we've been talking about. It's not just the SolarWinds hack, it's the election interference, as the intelligence community put out in its report in January. It's what's happening in Ukraine. It's the treatment, again, of people who oppose President Putin around the world. So it's a very broad brush. I think when you actually look at the sanctions, I mean, clearly, preventing U.S. banks from trading in Russian debt, that ruble denominated and non-ruble denominated, beginning in June, that is something new. There were already some sanctions on Russia's debt, but they're greater now. And the SVR again has been sanctioned, but it was sanctioned before. So some of what's in this package today was there before. It's true that the Trump administration sanctioned certain individuals, and some of these individuals have been re-sanctioned. I mean, you can read again, Mr. Prigozhin is mentioned again, but he's already been sanctioned. He was part of the CATSA sanctions, some time ago. So I think it's difficult at the moment. On the one hand, it sounds very all-encompassing. On the other hand, I think we have to see what it actually translates into practically, and I think we don't really know that yet. So I would hesitate to, I would definitely say that these are broader sanctions, but it's not clear, how much tougher they will be. The ruble was obviously affected by them, and the value went down. That could change. So I think it's a little bit too early to say that these are Iranian type sanctions yet.
We have just about 5 minutes left or so. And I know you both have to get back, Elena and Anton, have to get back to work on this news day. But let me go out with just one more question. And I'll ask you to kind of, you're a Dr. Stent is an academic, and I'm going to ask you to blend those together and say, how do we climb down from this? Because you have this new administration, just 2 months born, and already it's a very, very serious situation. Is there a way that you can see that either side or both sides can climb down from these positions or de-escalate what is going on? And I will start with Anton, and then I'll go to Elena.
I would struggle to answer that directly, because as a journalist, I try to understand what's going on and where things are headed, and I really can't offer that kind of advice. But I will point out that I see that there's a question in the chat about the impact, for instance, of sanctions on American companies operating in the region. There continue to be all kinds of connections between America and Russia that one would expect to be the kind of binding mechanism that would be relied on for some kind of improvement. Under the Trump administration, we heard a lot about various business roundtables or track 2 type programs that would be part of improving the relationship. Those efforts in part never really got off the ground. In others, it was hard to see the extent to which they helped. But you still do have these connections. But it should be noted that these connections are declining almost, it feels like, by the day these days. And there I'm thinking of, for instance, the News with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which does really very serious work on journalistic work on Russia, and they are now starting to actually have their journalists leaving the country. So it is sometimes tough to see an improvement in the near future.
And Elena, there in Moscow, what do you see? Any way to, kind of pull this back from the brink?
I would also like to join Anton with not being able to give much of advice. I can only say that I wish the two governments would at least agree on deconflicting mechanisms in the military field. That's the minimum one should expect. For example, the Russian government has been proposing since 2014 to re-establish regular communications between military to military between Russia and NATO. Now, NATO has been hesitant to do this. There is communications only on the heads of staff, general staff level, that are happening like every 4 or 5 months or so. Russia would like this to be also on expert and lower level in the military field. And I think, the West and NATO is treating this as a reward, again, for some good Russian behavior, and doesn't agree to this because Russia behaves bad. Now, I think that military to military communication is not a reward. It's the minimum that we should be expecting the two governments to agree upon, so that we can at least have mechanisms for deconfliction and for reaction to incidents that can happen and grow into something really bad.
Okay, well, I think we're going to leave it there. and allowed you to get back to work. So I really want to thank our audience for the very good questions. And I want to thank Anton Troianovski, who is in Kiev right now, and Elena Chernenko in Moscow, both of them, New York Times, Kommersant, really top-notch journalists. And we really appreciate your being with us this morning under very difficult circumstances and breaking news. And Dr. Sten, thank you very much for jumping in with your expertise, because this is, you know, when there's breaking news, sometimes it's very hard to stand back and say, what is happening and where are we going? And obviously we don't know precisely where we're going, but a dramatic day. So thank you very much. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining the our boot camp, Journalist Bootcamp, sponsored by Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and of course funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And we're very grateful for that. So thanks for joining, and we will see you soon.